Okay, this next lecture segment is the phylum Platyhelminthes. So this is the third phylum of the 9 that we will cover in this section of the course. And this is the first phylum that we have discussed, which is triploblastic and bilaterally symmetric. So because it's triploblastic, that means it has a mesoderm. But this group is classified as acoelomate, meaning there's no space within the mesoderm that we would refer to as the body cavity. So acoelomate means no body cavity within the mesoderm. So the body is solid, except for the digestive cavity, which is a different kind of cavity than the coelom. So the Platyhelminthes have a gastrovascular cavity very similar in concept to the gastrovascular cavity of the cnidarians. They have no anus, similar to the cnidarians, and so we refer to their digestive system as incomplete. So that is similar to the cnidarians, but what's different from the cnidarians is that the flatworms are triploblasts and bilaterally symmetric, whereas the cnidarians are diploblasts and radially symmetric. Now, the Platyhelminthes includes species that are parasites, such as the tapeworm and the fluke, and also species that are free-living, which means non-parasites. The environments that they live in are typically marine, freshwater, and then some terrestrial environments. I will link this short video of a flatworm swimming in the ocean. This would be a non-parasitic flatworm into your module so you can watch that. So one flatworm that is actually pretty well studied is called the planarian. And the planarian is not a parasite, it's free living. It has the gastrovascular cavity, and what's interesting about the planarian is it has 2 eye spots which can sense light, and the mouth of the planarian is actually in the center part of the body. So there's a long, almost like a hose, that extends out from the middle part of the body, and at the end of the hose, and the hose is technically called the pharynx, at the end of that hose there is a mouth, which is the opening to the digestive system. But the digestive system shown in red in this diagram is just one chamber, and any food particles that are taken in will stay in this chamber. Remember that the lining of the gastrovascular cavity, which derives from endoderm tissue in the embryo, will secrete enzymes into the space. The macromolecules will be broken down into monomers. The monomers will be absorbed into the body. And any waste, which means anything that cannot be broken down, will come back out through the mouth. So the same opening, which is the mouth, is also the anus. The nerve net crosses over the body, but there is, in this organism, more neurons concentrated at one end of the body. So we call that the cerebral ganglia, and that's really a way of saying a very primitive kind of brain. Now, the amount of decision making that a planarian can do is limited, but there is a little bit of a concentrated neural tissue on this end of the animal. If you cut the animal in half or into thirds, what's interesting is any part of the animal can regenerate the eye spots and the cerebral ganglia. So it's interesting that you can cut the planarian, and if you cut it into 3 pieces, a week later you'll have 3 planarians in the test tube. And these guys are small. They're like, less than a centimeter long. But they are free living and they're interesting. And I will link up this video as well so you can watch the planarian moving around. So in terms of parasitic flatworms, there are a couple of groups. One is shown here, the tapeworm, which is genus Tinea. And this is a very flat worm, except at one end it has kind of a rounded structure called the scolex. And that scolex has hooks on it, and it attaches to the intestine inside the host. And then the rest of the body is made up of these little segments called proglottids, which are full of eggs. And as the host eats food and digests it, the worm absorbs the nutrients directly from that food. And it stays in the intestine because the scolex is attached. And then it just releases, basically these proglottids break off of the end of the worm and release the eggs into the feces. The way that you get a tapeworm is through eating animals that have the tapeworms in them and then not cooking that food. So uncooked food, especially meat products, can get some of these eggs into your body. And with the tapeworm, there is either a cow or a pig intermediate that's typically part of the life cycle. With some of the other parasitic worms, there can be other intermediate hosts that complete the life cycle of that worm. But the important thing is always cook your food so that any of these kinds of parasites are killed before you eat it. Another flatworm that's discussed in lab is called the liver fluke, and there's also one called the blood fluke. And flukes are like tapeworms. Tapeworms are fairly large. They're probably, once they're grown, they can be 6 or 7 inches long at least. Flukes are about a centimeter or 2 centimeters in size. They're not microscopic. Now the eggs are microscopic, and so when you eat it, you don't know that you're getting it in that uncooked food. Now the next phylum that we're going to cover is one of the largest phyla in the animal kingdom. It is second in terms of size and diversity. The arthropods are the most diverse and largest group by far. But the mollusks, there's about 100,000 species of mollusks, something like that. And these are triploblastic, so like the flatworms, they're triploblastic. Like the flatworms, they're bilaterally symmetrical. But these actually have a true coelom. And when you look at the clam dissection, the clam is a mollusk. You can see a small coelom in the clam. So the flatworms did not have a coelom, but these guys do. And the other thing that the mollusks have is an anus. So unlike the flatworms, they have a complete digestive system. The 3 main body parts that all mollusks have somewhere in the body, we call it the foot, the visceral mass. Visceral means the internal organs. So a large portion of the body that is all the internal organs. And then a structure called the mantle. The mantle is typically a thin body covering that secretes a shell for the animals that do have a shell. So if you have a mollusk that has a shell, and a lot of them do, the mantle will be a thin tissue right next to that shell, because the shell is secreted from that tissue in sort of a semi-liquid form, and then it hardens on the outer part of the animal. So those 3 parts, the foot, the visceral mass, and the mantle, are very telling. They're used to identify an organism as a mollusk. There are 4 classes that you need to know the names of. So class Gastropoda, you need to know that particular class name, and you need to know that members of that class would be snails and slugs. Snails have a shell, slugs do not. Class Polyplacophora, you want to say that out loud, Polyplacophora, include animals that are called chitons. CH is a hard sound, so chitons. We'll look at some pictures of those. Class Bivalvia would be clams, oysters, scallops, things that have 2 shells. So BI means 2. And class Cephalopoda, cephala refers to the head and poda refers to foot, so it's basically an animal with a head and a foot, which is actually kind of correct. So octopus, squid, and cuttlefish, they have a big brain. And they have a foot. The muscular foot is split into usually 8 tentacles. So this is just a general structure. They show a snail here, but it's actually kind of similar for the clam. You have somewhere on the body, you have this muscular structure called the foot, and that's used for locomotion. So the clam had a foot that came out from between the 2 shells and used to move the animal. On a snail, it's the entire part that's basically outside of the shell, which is used for moving. And then inside the shell, if there's a shell, would be your visceral mass. So that would be all these organs here. And then the mantle is shown here in green. The green line here is the tissue called the mantle, and then that secretes the shell when the animal is young. You can see in purple the digestive tract includes a mouth, and then in the snail the anus is actually right over the back of the neck. So that's interesting. It's kind of a twisted digestive system on the snail. On other mollusks, the anus would be more where you would expect it to be on the other end of the animal. But snails are interesting. You're not going to have to identify all the organs but for lecture, but you can see a mouth and an anus. That means that there is a complete digestive system. And then the 3 parts of the mollusks are the foot, the visceral mass, which is the bunch of organs right here, and then the mantle. So the first class is Polyplacophora. These are chitons. Chitons are a little bit like a snail, but there's not a clear head. If you watch long enough, you can see which direction he's moving, and you can guess which end would have the small, very small brain. He has 8 plates, 8 shells, and then on this one, a lot of times the soft-bodied part of the animal is pink, but on this one it's sort of got these brownish colors here coming from underneath the shell, and he would just crawl along a surface. And he has a little mouth structure called the radula that he scrapes the rock and eats whatever he can scrape off of the rock. Class Bivalvia would be things that have 2 shells and a hinge. And then the foot comes out from between the 2 shells to use for locomotion. These are mussels, clams, and oysters, and scallops. Gastropoda would be snails and slugs. And it's interesting that on the snails and the slugs, I think as well, I think the place where the anus comes out on the slug is the same. It's on the back of the neck. But these guys are called gastropods. And then nudibranchs. I will put this little video in your module so you can watch it. This is a nudibranch. But what's interesting about the nudibranchs is they look a lot like those ocean flatworms that we saw in the earlier part of the lecture. So it's sometimes hard to tell unless you really know what structures to look for. These guys can look very similar and be, for example, even in different phyla. So you can watch that and kind of think about that. I'm not going to try to trick you with some really complicated identifications, but it can be difficult. So like I was saying, gastropods have this strange characteristic called torsion, which just means the digestive tract twists back over and the anus releases the feces on the head or on the neck. That's specific to the gastropods. Like I said, the other classes of mollusks don't have that particular trait. The cone snails, these are really interesting because they are really dangerous. They have neurotoxins, really a mixture of neurotoxins, and people study these to figure out if they can use these medically. But spend some time watching the cone snail. The cone snail, you're going to be amazed at how big this guy gets when he's swallowing his prey. He gets enormous. It's really impressive. And the cephalopoda would be these animals that have a big brain. They also have large eyes. And then they have typically their foot, which you remember is one of the 3 parts of all the mollusks, is split into these tentacles. And so you have the nautilus, which actually has a shell, and the cuttlefish, the squid, and the octopus. They have a shell, but it's small and it's on the inside. So the shell is not an important part of protection for them. But these guys, the octopus, the squid, and the cuttlefish, and the nautilus to some extent, these are predators. So the shell, it becomes less important because they're actually the ones doing the hunting. And they have a big brain, which we think allows them to be hunters, predators. So I'm going to end this segment here, and then you have a chance to watch some of those videos of these different organisms